That's part of the sound of the makings of one of the greatest revival meetings that ever took place on our soil. It has become known as the Cane Ridge Revival. Several days before the Cane Ridge meeting started, wagons began to come in from all over Kentucky. People of all the then known denominations, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, came to get a bit of heaven on earth. By the way, along with the Christian saints came the godless sinners. However different they may have been, they both were curious to see what God was going to do among them. The saints were curious to know if God really loved them and had a purpose for them here on earth. The sinners were curious to know if there really was a God at all, and curious why in the world 25,000 people from all over Kentucky would come into the wilderness and rough it to seek God, and they themselves didn't even know or feel Him. Among both groups, there were the business people who didn't care a hoot whether there was a God or not. All they cared about was their God, the almighty dollar. They set up tents selling pies and candies, cakes, cigars, tobacco for chewing and smoking, whiskey and other alcoholic drinks. Boy, were they going to be in for a surprise, as we'll see. When at last it was time for the meeting to begin, no less than 7 preacher platforms were erected out of logs that stood up high above the camping area and spaced far enough apart so that different preachers could all preach at the same time to the crowd around them without disturbing the other preachers preaching. The hard log pews were all taken up, but that didn't matter. Everyone was too excited to sit down anyway. One by one, the preachers mounted the preacher platforms and began to preach. It didn't take long before the Holy Spirit fell on the people. They began to come under great conviction of sin and began to shout, "What must I do to be saved?" Others fell on the ground, slaying in the Spirit. Many sang all at the same time. I'd like to quote some excerpts from what was written by William Burke, a pastor preaching who saw firsthand the extraordinary move of God on his own preaching. He said, "We commenced reading a hymn with an audible voice, and then by the time we concluded singing and praying, we had around us, standing on their feet by a fair calculation, 10,000 people. I gave out my text in the following words: 'We must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ.' And before I concluded, my voice was not heard from the groans of distress and the shouts of triumph. Here I remained, Sunday night, Monday night. During that whole time, there was not a single moment in 2.5 days that I didn't stop preaching solid." What's amazing about that revival is that at times there was more than 1,000 shouting at one time. They could be heard for miles. One curious unbeliever named James Fidley, as he rode his horse into the Cane Ridge meeting camp, exclaimed, "The noise was like the roar of Niagara. A vast sea of human beings seemed to be agitated as if by a storm. I counted 7 ministers in all preaching at one time. Some on stumps, others on wagons. Some of the people were singing, others praying, some crying for mercy the most piteous way. Others were shouting most ferociously. While witnessing these scenes, a strange feeling came over me that I'd never felt before. My heart beat as if I was going to have an attack. My knees trembled and my lips quivered as if though I must fall to the ground right then and there. Strange supernatural powers seemed to prevail over the entire task. I never seen anything like it. Soon after, I left and went into the woods, and there I strove to rally up courage to go back in there. After some time, I returned to the scene of excitement. The waves, which, if it were possible, still raised higher. that same awful feeling came over me again. I saw at least 500 mowed down as if a battery of 1,000 guns had opened fire on them, and immediately followed shrieks and shouts that rent the very heavens. My hair rose on the back of my head, and I fled into the woods for a second time and had wished I had stayed home. I should say that Finley survived to become one of the strongest frontier preachers that ever lived. Listen to me. As I close this story, God is spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. That's what John chapter 4:24 says. Allow me to say that I've seen a mighty move of God even in our ministry in our day and age. I recall the summer of 1984 while doing a camp in Wyoming in a remote part of the state, way off north in the boonies. The only thing around us was a handful of trees, prairie dogs, coyotes, and the wind. But the Spirit of the Lord came down in a powerful way. On the last night of a 5-day camp, I invited the youth, 9 to 12 years old, imagine that, just young ones, to come to the altar to get right with God. To my amazement, O ye of little faith, 3/4 of the youth came running to the altar and literally fell down all at one time and began to cry out to God in all manner of prayer. I've seen it several times before, but not quite as powerful as this one time. Kids were crying and singing and praising, just flat still on their face before God. I'm sure that if an unbelieving psychiatrist had come in at that very moment, he would have thought they'd all gone completely stark raving mad. But I knew better. I saw youth converted, delivered of deep sins of all kinds. I'll never forget one blonde-haired boy who was under deep travail, praying, crying, and shouting all at the same time. He was completely enraptured in the presence of God, totally oblivious to all those around him. He continued for over 1 hour in solid prayer. He was the last to leave, and when he finally finished, silence once again entered the Wyoming wilderness, and the Holy Spirit's outward manifestation was stilled for the night. This boy rose to his feet so weak that his counselor had to prop him up under his arms to hold him from falling. I'll never forget, as long as I live, the boy's face. It glowed with the glory of God. Every adult leader recognized the Lord's presence immediately. It was as if we were in the presence of the Lord through this young man. All I could say to him in a feeble way was, "Wow, it looks like the Lord has really touched your life tonight." Then he spoke and said, "I saw Jesus." When he said that, we adults began to get tears at the same time, and the warmth of God came all over us. Then he spoke just once more and said, "I saw and heard things that I can't even tell you, but I'll never forget the smile that Jesus had on his face for me." That boy left the wilderness changed and altered for life. You see, the same Holy Spirit that worked back in the 1800s is the same that works today. Have you been touched by him? Seek the Lord with all your heart and live in the light of revival every day. That can be a living experience for you.